Okay, plan making and implementation, it's 30% of the exam. These are the recommended readings. You have access to all these, so in the PDF or the PowerPoint, but it's quite a big list. Again, it's I'll try and do my best to tell you where each one sort of fits in as we get through this. So 4.2, what we're looking for is conducting research and acquiring knowledge. There was a question about how much math is on this exam. This will cover it. It's not complicated math, if any, and spatial analysis, public engagement, communication, preparing to plan, formulating plans, policies, and plan implementation, monitoring, assessment, project and program management, and social justice. These are all those subcategories within that plan making and implementation. So within that 30% covers these topic areas. Quantitative research, the numbers, population estimates and projections, shift share analysis, comparing alternatives with unequal lives, budgeting, finance and cost analysis, and then cost benefit analysis. We talk about data. We're talking about there's three types of data. There's discrete, continuous, and nominal. Discrete is finite data values, a count or a score. It's integers only. Continuous is data within a range, continuous range, distance, temperature, height. And then nominal data is where we assign values to either a label. So a Likert scale or one good, two bad type of. We talk about scales. There's three different types of scales. You have an ordinal scale where it indicates the position of a list, so like a ranking. An interval scale, think of like a ruler or time. So as we sort of scale it out across the measurement between the values is proportional. And then a ratio scale is ratio between two numbers. The outcome is independent of the unit of measurement. So think of floor area ratio. We're measuring square footage, but the outcome is just a number. So the ratio is between two intervals. It's independent of the unit of measurement. You're just looking for the ratio of one value to another. Key terms, variance. It's how far a set of numbers are spread out. That's related to standard deviation. I don't want to scare you in thinking this is college statistics here, but again, look at that Wikipedia article about what a bell chart is. It'll cover sort of the depth of how well you need to know this. So the measurement of variability around a mean is the standard deviation. A high standard deviation, a low standard deviation is z-score. Know what that means. High standard deviation, sort of the points have a wide spread. A low standard deviation is sort of tightly clustered around the mean. So when I say mean, I mean the average. A median is the value that divides those numbers into two equal parts. A mode is the value with the highest frequency, and then a range is the difference between the largest and the smallest value. So a couple of quick examples, these number sets, we sort of drop these in. So the mean, this 11.1, you add all these numbers up and you divide it by the number of numbers that are there, you get the average. The median, we throw these numbers in order. 8 is going to be the number that divides them in two. This is important on an even number set. There's not one number that will sit in the middle. So to calculate the median of an even number set, you find the two numbers that are in the middle, and then you take the average of the two. Mode is the numbers that are there in the most frequency. So if there are two numbers that appear in this top, this one on the left, 3 and 6 each appear 3 times. So the mode is 3 and 6, or expressed as 3, 6. And on the right, there isn't any value that's there more than once. So the mode is all values. And then the range is just sort of that spread. So you take the highest number and the lowest number, subtract it, and you get the range. This is the extent of the math you might have to do. It's real simple. They give you a calculator, correct, Trevor?
They do.
Yeah.
Yep, they give you a calculator, but I'm happy to say that I didn't need to use it. So,
and if Trevor doesn't need a calculator, neither will you.
It's true.
Yeah. The quantitative research continuing, the U.S. Census know what it is, when it's conducted, why it's important. It's a count of every living person, conducted every 10 years. It's mandated by the Constitution. It's used to distribute seats in the Senate, budget. So how do we distribute that $400 billion of federal funds to local, state, tribal governments each year? Plays a big role with the number of population. Quickly growing cities will often conduct a special census to sort of get a bigger chunk of the budget. So know what the importance of the census is. Surveying, be familiar with the different types of survey methods, face-to-face, telephone, mail, web-based. Know when you should do a particular type of survey. What are the pros and cons of each one? Roughly sample size, how much would you need to have a sufficient confidence level? So if you're doing a plan for a neighborhood of 30,000 people, if you do a survey and get 40 responses, it probably isn't statistically significant. But know that a face-to-face survey, you get rich descriptive information. It's tough to sort of analyze that information. A telephone survey, there's survey biases. So now people are dropping their landlines. You may not be able to reach people who don't have a landline. Mail, typically slower, more costly, lower response rate. A web-based, you might not reach people with access to the internet, so that'll bring in a term called the digital divide. But know what the difference between each survey method is and what the pros and cons are. Differing from quantitative research is qualitative research. So you're gathering information that isn't in numerical form. It's typically harder to analyze than the numbers. So unlike quantitative numbers, qualitative analysis yields data in words and images. So things like land use or key person interviews. You can obtain qualitative data by field research, interviews, focus groups, taking pictures, a visual preference survey, or where you're getting sort of feedback. It's called qualitative research. Kind of bridging all this together, mapping in GIS. How do we visualize that data? GIS is powerful, allows a great way to tell our story. For many, maps are easier to read, easier to understand. We're publishing maps now out on the internet. So know that what GIS is essentially a spreadsheet tied to the Earth. And GIS is used to collect, analyze, and model spatial and geographic data. It's common in planning offices because the cost has decreased, the analytical skills of planners have increased, and large amounts of data have become relatively readily available. There's a lot of APIs and data sets that are out there. And then how do we interpret that? So maps that show not only locations, area, distances, but what types of analysis can we do with GIS? You know, Esri is a big partner of the APA. There's a summit that they conduct every spring or early in the year. It's called the Geodesign Summit, and I've attended there the last 5 years. Every single year, the president of the APA is there, and they're talking about how important GIS is to planners. So I can always tell when an engineer has come into a community to create their zoning map, because residential areas are purple, and it's like some random color splat is on the wall at the city hall. There's something called the land-based classification system by the APA. They've established colors for different types of land uses. It's a short little read. There's some great text in there, and then it's followed by pages and pages of different color codes for different types of land uses. I myself don't think all the color palettes are that attractive, so I do deviate from the neon yellow. But they do a great job in describing how planners can classify land uses based on their function and their use. It's called the LCBS or LBCS. Public engagement, it's core to our planning profession. We'll cover this a bit when we get into ethics. Their sort of primary job is to make sure the public is involved, to effectively have meaningful input into any type of planning process. So we have a special goal to include low-income, minority, and historically underrepresented communities. So why is it important? We inform the public. Public outreach helps protects the public, It will result in better plans, builds consensus, and increases the likelihood of implementation. I like to say planners should be planning with a community, not at a community, and public engagement is sort of key to that. The participation methods, I mentioned the surveys before, but you'll need to know what type of, what's the best approach to involve a community in some type of planning process. They might tell you a specific demographic you're trying to hold a meeting with, meetings, presentations, and workshops, any concerns about sample size, again, cost, the biases, know what a vision workshop is, a SWOT analysis, a charrette, websites. There's something, this might be an equator question, there's something called the Delphi method. It was created by the RAND Corporation, I think in the 70s, during the Cold War, as they sort of tried to figure out what Soviet missiles would target in the United States. And so they created this sort of, it's rounds of thinking, and the hope is policy experts have these rounds of thinking and they converge on one final answer or consensus. It's called the Delphi method. It's been in every single AICP planning preparation material I've ever seen in the last 20 years. So again, know that Wikipedia level of what it is. And that's the other thing, you need to recognize that even though you might be a planner in Gardner, Kansas, this exam is going to test any town USA. You got to sort of think beyond your sort of local bubble and look at how regional planners are approaching things, people working for MPOs and COGs in big cities. Social media, in today's world, using social media is an important tool for planners. It gets back to the public involvement and keeping the public informed. The APA, underline this, has published a communications guide. So there's an asterisk next to that. They've gone through to publish this, put it on your study guide. They've identified what the goals are of social media and how planners can use social media to communicate with residents. So,
Devin, I just want to interrupt real quick. If you go back to that slide, that is a tremendous resource there. The APA's Communication Guide 2.0, it's available on their website. It's fantastic. It's about a 10-page document, and it really hits home all the different things that we should be familiar with social media.
Other things to be mindful of, there are open meeting laws, social media. If you're not involved in local government, you may not know this, but there's something called a quorum. There's something about how many elected officials can be in the same place at the same time discussing issues related to a city. So know what open meeting laws are, how they impact planning, why they exist. Establishing written social media guidelines is a good first step for clarity. And then we highlight one example, Metro Plan for Orlando's Public Involvement Plan. They specifically address all the different ways to access how throughout that process they were posting comments and maintaining public record. Sunshine laws and the Open Meetings Act requiring meetings to be held in public, proper notices. So all the issues related to really an open and transparent planning process. So there's no sort of deals being made in the back rooms of City Hall. When we talk about advocacy, we're really talking about the three pioneers of advocacy planning. First is Paul Davidoff, created it in the 1960s. Advocacy planning is a pluralistic and inclusive planning theory where planners seek to represent the interests of various groups within a society. So really putting yourselves in the shoes of a community and taking their place to represent their interests. There's something called the Ladder of Citizen Participation by Sherry Arnstein. Know this. Know how many steps are in here. There's 8 steps in the Ladder of Citizen Participation. These are called rungs of power. So starting at the bottom, manipulation, therapy, informing, consultation, placation, partnership, delegated power, and citizen control. And know that the APA expects nothing less than these sort of top 3 rungs. Anything short of there, I would think on this exam, they're not saying you're doing enough to represent the interests of citizens. Then the last one are Alinsky organizations. These are Saul Alinsky, sort of a radical planner formed really to get neighborhood activation. So organizing neighborhoods, put a neighborhood organizer sent to the neighborhood, identifies the problems, develops citizen awareness, and creates actions. Coming back to communication. So these are some things that we've noted. To succeed, planners must have excellent written, verbal, and communication skills. You need to be able to clearly communicate, whether it's something in writing or at a meeting. So a clear and understandable visual, written, and spoken concept. Know the importance about building relationships, conducting meetings, and then media relations. Avoid using planning jargon. Planners, for whatever reason, have this desire to, I don't even know how, it's just jargon. There's a book that the APA publishes. It's called Planning in Plain English. And when you read it, they'll show you how a planner wants to word a sentence and then how to say it just more succinctly. When I grade my students' papers, it's usually a red flag for me when I have to, they keep telling me the same thing over and over again. It reminds, or it's my indication that they don't really know what they're talking about. They don't have the ability to just make one concise statement and stand with it. So avoid planning jargon and being able to read and write well and present well. Visioning, goal setting, identifying key issues. When beginning a planning exercise, one of the very first steps should always be to meet with the stakeholders to determine what the overall vision for the project should be. Once you've established that overall vision, establish the goals that meet the vision and set them early. It's important to find out what the key issues are. These can be broad or specific, but these issues should be considered throughout the entire planning process and ideally should be addressed in the plan's recommendations. It's important not only to consider existing issues, but try to determine and anticipate any future issues that could be addressed. We get into something called forecasting. So we're estimating current and future population. It's important for long-range planning. It assists government agencies and decision makers in taxing districts, planning for things like schools, senior services, new roads, new streets, new facilities, and again, determining and receiving that federal funding. So population, that's a collection that contains anything. It could be the pens in your desk. It's referred to in statistics as a population. So it's not always people. Regarding, so if we're doing any type of, if you're looking at any type of books or articles on statistics and forecasting, for the most part, what we do, we'll reference people, but just know that the term population in statistics is anything. A sample is a subset of that population. A random sample, any object, or it's critical to statistical validity. Any member of that population had an equal chance of being selected. So a random sample survey is critical to survey validity. A stratified random sample is where you can take a strata of that population. So when you're, if you have a community survey or census and you're breaking out a specific age cohort or something by gender, that's a strata of that population. So estimates are calculated for current population levels. How do we estimate population? We use something called natural increase and migration. There's something called ratio or step down. Symptomatic methods are just clues that we can see in a neighborhood, maybe doorbells, mailboxes. I know I used to have to go do some TIF work, and we'd do resident relocation. We'd have to figure out how many residents were in a TIF. We'd always be counting power meters and mailboxes. So symptomatic methods are ways that a planner can sort of identify. These sort of seem nuanced, like a forecast and a projection and an estimate. They're all a little different. An estimate is something for current population levels. So what is my current population? I'm going to have that estimate. A forecast is subjective. I'll come back to that. But a projection is sort of more of a mathematical. Your population is projected to be X, and you're using either cohort survival, employment-driven, a step down, a regression analysis. It's math. It's a population projection. A forecast, you're going to modify that projection by some, you might say our population is projected to be 60,000 in the next 10 years, but we just are getting a Hyundai manufacturing plant. So we're going to amend our projection, and we're forecasting a population of 75,000. So forecasts can be subjective. You include the projection, but you can, so just know they're all a little bit nuanced. Migration, people moving in and out of a study area. I mentioned natural increase a few times. That's real simple. It's the crude birth rate minus the death rate. So it's a way to calculate population. This is a population pyramid. You might see something a little more dramatic that might ask you to figure out what a city needs to be planning for in the next 20 years. So you'll age these cohorts 20 years and maybe come to the conclusion you need more senior housing. Shift share analysis, location quotient, might be another equator question, something that's in every APA study material. Conduct a location quotient analysis of one. I think in their illustrative questions, there's a great example. So it's used by regional scientists to figure out a local community's share of a regional economy or the national economy. So you're comparing two different economies to one another. Your outcome, there's three outcomes. It's a number that's less than one, a number that's equal to one, or a number that is greater than one. That's over here. And basically, if the location quotient is less than one, it suggests that your local employment is less than expected. So you must be importing that service or good into your local economy. A 1.0 would suggest the local economy is exactly sufficient. And then a location quotient that is greater than one suggests local employment is greater than expected for a given industry. So it tells you how specialized an industry is in specific sectors of the economy. Another piece of this is creating and evaluating alternatives. So as part of the planning process, you might create alternatives. So a community-wide comprehensive plan, you might look at a couple of different policies that might result in different scenarios. Being able to evaluate each one is going to be important, considering visually and how you might show the potential development impacts for each alternative, and how you're evaluating each alternatives with their stakeholders and the residents, and figuring out what's realistic and cost effective to reach the plan's vision. During this step, each alternative should be weighed given its potential positive and negative effects and impacts on the community. So really growing in our field is visualization techniques. We've always sort of had these sketches done by planners, but now with modern technology, there's almost an expectation to see something in 3D by our residents. So just know how these tools can encourage public input and participation. Be familiar with some of the key techniques when they're appropriate. Tools like Photoshop, SketchUp, hand rendering. We get to plan implementation. After a plan is adopted, you have a future land use plan. Next would come the zoning map and the codes that help implement that future land use and long-term vision. PUDs, overlays, transfer development rights or TDRs, incentives, intensity bonuses, FAR, bulk. Know what all those terms are, how they're applied. Zoning administration, how zoning is administered. Again, not for your specific community, but what is a typical administration and approval process? Plan commission, zoning board of appeals, your city council, and then just getting decision maker buy-in. How do we, could be scenario questions and how to engage stakeholders and to get broad support for any type of plan. Related to budgeting, know why budgeting is important to planners, understand the difference between a capital budget and your department's operating budget, how you would go about preparing a budget, identifying your revenue sources, forecasting and estimating budgeting or expenses. Related to finance, equity versus efficiency financing, horizontal versus vertical equity. Some key terms, just know what they are: progressive, proportional, and regressive taxation. We get to cost analysis. There's something called a goals achievement matrix, or GAM. Again, something you might just throw on Wikipedia. You'll see a little picture of it, what it is. Cost effective analysis, cost benefit analysis, and cost revenue analysis. Some terms to be familiar with. There's something we've seen a lot. I don't know when it started, maybe in Chicago with the Bulls, but the demonstration projects for public art. A lot of cities have started to now really test recommendations. I know we did a complete street study where before we had the city narrow the road, we had them just throw some barricades up to pretend the road had been narrowed to see how the community would react. But before you go all in on a project, a demonstration project, shorter term, smaller scale, allows you to see what might influence long-term change. Monitoring and assessment. Once we create these plans, how do we monitor them? How do we know we're achieving success? There's been a huge focus on this more recently. A lot of communities are, I know, asking us to identify measures of performance and metrics. So know that a performance measurement involves the regular measurement of results, builds data about the effectiveness of our plans, programs, and developments. And then we need to consider what outcomes matter, how they can be measured. In general, determining measures of performance is an excellent way to track a plan's progress, helps you set workload priorities, assist in budgeting. And then an outcome indicator, beyond measuring performance, how do you know when you've achieved that goal? Some other key terms related to all this: RFI, RFP, RFQ. The American Planning Association has identified a way that they suggest communities hire a consultant. So it's a three-step process, or a two-step: first an RFQ, then an RFP. Grants, preparing budgets, managing contracts, scheduling, allocating staff. There's going to be PAS reports on just about all of these. And then last but certainly not least, social justice. Planning for diverse and underserved communities. Planners must advocate for social justice. Our code of ethics states, we shall seek social justice by working to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of the disadvantaged and promote racial and economic integration. So this is especially important with today's, our country's demographics. They continue to become more diverse. We're seeing larger gaps in our economics. So social justice is important. Related to that, social empowerment. I talked about the advocacy planning. Became popular in the 60s with the grassroots organizations that really came out to solve local issues. So planners at all levels should support grassroots organizations and also make sure during the planning process that residents' concerns are taken into account. All right, Trevor, you're up.